Okay.
Cool, we're going to get going again. Give us a go.
Let's go. Okay.
Cool, so before the break, we went through for many people, with the intermediate people who raise their hands, we've gone through some very basic pre-request and test stuff as well. But what we want to do is step that up a little bit, and we introduce more of the kind of the advanced techniques or the advanced features of Postman, especially the testing side of it, in this next testing session. Module, part two.
Part two.
Let's go part two. So what do we mean by, yeah, of course.
If we have tests in the collection and the request itself, which one would run, or would all of those would run?
Sorry, can you read?
So we have tests in collection level and at the request level as well. So would both of them run?
Yeah, they would run.
Yes.
Prashant's nodding his head. I would say yes. Prashant's nodding his head. He's awesome. So yeah, we're in agreement. Yes, they would. Yes.
Yeah, so for everybody that may not have been able to hear what that question was, basically he was asking that if you have tests at the collection or folder level and also in your request itself, will it execute all of those? It's not going to ignore any of them. And the answer is yes. The order of execution is what is going to change. So if it's at your collection level or folder level, those will get executed before your request level tests get executed. And if I'm wrong, Prashant will point and tell me I'm wrong.
Yes.
Can you at a request level disable the collection level test? So you might have like 200, right? But then you've got 3 tests that are negative testing. You're expecting that.
You
Gotta put it in a different folder.
Yeah, so there's different ways you could handle that. So for others, once again, that couldn't hear, he's asking, can you like systematically disable certain tests based on the results or execution of other tests? So there's a couple ways you could probably solve that. If you just know you want to go and shut down some tests, whether it's at the collection level or it's on the request level, you just go comment it out. It's just basic JavaScript code. Or you could do some sort of systematic, like, checks or things like that, like an if statement or whatever. If you have a flag you want to check, and it can, you can just wrap it in an if statement. It'll just keep moving if it doesn't meet the criteria, things like that. So yeah, there's ways you can do it systematically. Like I say, it's all just basic JavaScript. So whatever you can do with JavaScript, you can do it in there. And so like the cool thing about that is you can get really creative with some of the things you can do, and it allows you to kind of do some advanced things. It's not just super basic stuff like we're showing here. We need to show this stuff, just for the sake of time and complexity and stuff like that. But yeah, you can get as like crazy as you want. I know Danny and I have in some of our tests in real world scenarios done things like that. So.
Cool, good questions. Like it.
Those are good questions, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, so moving on, what do we mean by advanced techniques? So checking the basics and checking the status code and response code is just going to give you really one view of what your API is doing or what the endpoint is doing. And there's lots of different aspects to the request and more importantly the response that can carry potential risks. So before starting or exploring a particular endpoint, you might map out certain potential risk areas that will pose a threat to the quality of the API. And you could look at things like the authentication, the headers, both response and request headers, the HTTP methods, the data itself, and what different parts of the data you can manipulate to push through, either on the params, in the body, the header, whatever. But each of these areas can be broken down in themselves and explored individually. And Postman has a lot of inbuilt features to allow you to do these certain checks and have them run automatically every time you press send. So much the same as checking for the status code or the response time. We can introduce some of these more complex scenarios into our testing and check them automatically. So we're going to break these down and highlight some of the more the gnarly, awesome features, because I love them. I like talking about them. But they're some of the ones that, if you've been using Postman for a while, you might not know they're in there. So we're just going to highlight some of them, and hopefully you'll learn some new things today. So first of all, dynamic variables. There's been dynamic variables within the application for a while. So you might know these as random in, or the GUID, or the timestamp. But recently we've added a subset of the Faker.js module. So this introduces things like a randomized data set that you can use in these different places where you can use dynamic variables. So as well as the dynamic variables, we've got the chai assertions. So some of the snippets you can see are using some of these chai assertion methods and chainable getters. And these can be used to expose some of the test areas that you wanted to check for, to check things that the data type, that is a string or an object or an array, but also things you can check for data to be one of something or to have something or to be below something. So it's just kind of building up the ideas that you had in your mind and allow you to execute these tests within Postman. And they're off the back of the pm.expect function. So this is within the test function itself, you've got pm.expect, which is then allowing you to use these different BDD-style test assertions. But also, as well as these, we've got a lot of built-in libraries. So this is, if you're familiar with especially Node applications and bringing different libraries into your projects, within Postman, we've got things like Lodash, which is a utility module, which is awesome, and allows you to do some really complex things in a really small, neat way, rather than creating lots of really gnarly, complex JavaScript within your test code. But also things like Moment, so manipulate, parse, and validate different time objects, which is a really awesome module. It's very popular in lots of different JavaScript applications. And there's also some other things in there as well, like Cheerio, schema validations with AGV, Crypto.js, and the ability to convert XML to JSON. So that's just some of the actual inbuilt modules within the application. But there's also some of the kind of local node type built-in functions, utilities within there, like query string, path, URL. So some of the other things.
So the Postman Console. So basically, the Postman Console is very much like your typical browser's dev console. I'm sure probably a lot of you are familiar with that. But it's kind of a little more tuned and dialed in for API development specifically, which is really nice. I find it personally, one of the best features of it is for debugging your tests, your assertions, scripts, things like that, because you can log out information to your console and gather that information within the Postman app itself.
A question about console logging. You went through a bunch of libraries. Is there a way to, like a library to turn off console logging? You know, I just tend to comment in or out my console.log, but there's other logging libraries where you can
Yeah, that.
talk about environment variable.
Yeah, so that's actually, of course, you'd ask that question after we deleted that slide. So it's a really good question, and I can show you an example maybe after this if you're going to the meetup after. But basically, his question was just kind of similar to what he asked earlier: is there a systematic way for us to enable and disable the console.log statements? Yes, there are. There's definitely ways to do it, and we did have a slide in here, and I apologize. We thought for the sake of time, we'd take it out. It was kind of like a bit of a war story that we were going to talk about, but we didn't want to bore people. But it was an actual real-world practical example that I had used. And I should be able to get that slide back pulled in, and I can kind of talk a little bit about it a little later on if you want to talk about it. So yeah, that's a really good question. Now I kind of kicking myself for deleting that slide. Okay. So what does the Postman Console do? So it'll log out and display all of the key aspects of a request, such as headers, body, status code, et cetera, things along those lines. You can also capture the response that is returned from the server and various information around that. We can see other pieces of information, such as proxies, certificates, things along those lines that may have been used, not to mention errors from the pre-request and test scripts that are executed. And lastly, one of the most powerful features is it allows you to utilize the console.log, which we had mentioned as well. This is, once again, a huge help when you're debugging your tests and your calls. So console.log, your new best friend. I know it's been one of my best friends when I'm doing any sort of API testing and I'm trying to debug my scripts, especially if they're complex scenarios and situations similar to like the questions that are being asked here today. What is it basically? It's just a JavaScript method if you're not familiar with it. I'm sure a lot of people are. It's just a basic JavaScript function that's in there, statement that can be super useful, and you can pop it in your pre-request scripts and your test scripts, things like that. And some would argue there's probably a better way to accomplish this with console.warn and all these other console functions and things like that. But really, it's kind of one of those things where you keep it simple and it's very, very effective.
Yeah, so we've talked about some of these things already, like the dynamic variables, the built-in modules, and some of the chai surgeons. What we want to do now is move on to a practical demonstration of this. So one of the collections that you imported at the start of the workshop, we're going to use that to work through some of these different examples. So we're going to do a demo now.
Demo.
Hopefully you can see the poster on the screen.
Perfect.
So I've imported the collections, obviously like you. I didn't have any trouble because I knew where they were. So there's a series of examples in here. In the Advanced Techniques folder, within there's 7 examples. We're not going to go through all of them. Some of them are there for you to take away and to work through in your own time. And there is different bits and pieces within these different examples, but we're going to walk through some of them, but not all of them, just due to time. If you want to go through every single one, that's cool, that's awesome. I can do that at any time because I love talking about it. But for now, I don't want to go too far, too fast for everyone in the room, because you're all at different levels. So if we grab the first one, which is the dynamic variables. So within this request, I've used some of the dynamic variables, which I want to make this bigger. Can people see that better now?
Yeah.
Yeah? No? Yeah, cool, awesome. So within this request itself is a really basic request. It's using the Postman echo service again, which is making a post request. And within the parameters on the URL, I've used one of the dynamic variables from the Faker.js module. So this is just going to create a random word. So when this gets executed, when I press send, it's going to resolve that variable, and it's going to give me back a random word within the URL. So within the URL, we can do that, but we can also do it in all the other places where you can use the dynamic variables that you might be familiar with already. So we'll move over to the headers, if you want to follow along with me. So we can also put it into the headers as well. So I've just taken another one here, where it's just going to create a random month, just to have something in the response when we make the request. But also in the body of this request, because it's a post request, we're sending some data to this endpoint, and I've used different aspects of the Faker.js module as well. So now we're going to create some data like a full name, a job title, a company name. And when we press send, we're going to see this repeated back to us in the response. So you want to go ahead and press send on that and see what you get back. Let's make this bigger. So what it's done now, in the response, if you can see that from the different places you are, it might be slightly smaller.
It looks fine on
It
the.
looks great for us, but so what that's done is I've pressed send, and it's resolved all these variables that I've added to the post, the body, the params, and also the headers itself. So the echo service repeats back. It's an echo service. It repeats back what you've added in. So that's just one way of using dynamic variables. Now there are lots of these available. It's a subset of the Faker.js module. It's not the whole complete thing. But there's lots of different things in there that are very, very useful for you to either seed a database with data. Maybe you're not interested in the data itself. You don't want to hard code the data, and you can send this through your post requests or anything else that you need to send random data with. So is everyone cool with that? Everyone understand what's going on there? Is that something new that people have not know that's in there already? Can I get a show of hands of who didn't know that was in there? Nice. Oh, that's brilliant. That's awesome. Exactly what I wanted to see.
Great.
Yeah, so within the GitHub repo, there's a lot of resources in there. So for the different sections, they'll have different resources that I'll be talking about, so different things. One of them is the API sandbox reference page. And on this page, this is all the things you can use within the sandbox. At the bottom of that page, it will have a long list of all the variables you can use within the application. But there also is another way within the application. So if I just open up one of these things here as an example, if you do double curly braces, it will open up the autocomplete menu. And within that, you can see that there's lots of different random variables in there that you can use within the request. So you're going to get that every time you're able to use that within the Postman app. Dollar, random, and then whatever. It could be BS, it could be a full name, it could be whatever. So everything that you can use within the Faker.js module, the subset of that, is in here. But also the documentation will kind of list that out in a bit more prettier format. So moving on to the second example. So we're sticking with the dynamic variables, but we want to see, I want to show you that you can use these within a mock as well. So Costa, if you were in the session this morning, there was a talk about using mocks and stuff, where you can also use the dynamic variables within a mock itself. So these are going to resolve when you use the mock. On the application, if you scroll over or mouse over to the examples in the top right, that will list out one of the mocks that I've created. So if you click on that, it's going to look exactly the same as the post request that we saw already. But as you can see, if you go back to example 2, there's nothing in this body. There's tests, but they're at the collection level, like we did with the first example. So they're going to run every time I press send. But with the mock itself, if you press send on that, the mock file is the mock server is going to use that example as the response, and then it's going to return back pretty much exactly the same, but randomized of what we did before. So that's just showing you can use these dynamic variables within mocks as well. So there's lots of different places you can use these things. Is everyone cool with that? Yes, Danny. Yes.
Chris is excited about it back there. I can see it.
Chris is loving it. Chris is loving it.
How much he loves it.
So like I mentioned before, don't save that. Like I said at the start, there's lots of different aspects of an API that you can test. And when you're moving into the API testing context, you might not be aware that you can do a lot of this testing within Postman itself. So these are I want to go through some of the things where you can use some of these shy assertions, as well as some of the kind of the inbuilt methods and functions that we've got available to you. So I've mentioned that API sandbox reference page at the start. So if you click on that link, there's lots of different things that you can use within the sandbox, within the pre-request, and within the test scripts. And I want to go through just a couple of these things. So feel free to make your request and press send and interact with what you're seeing on the screen. But I just want to go through some of the things that these are checking for. So I've added tests to check for, we've added checks to, I can't even talk. We've added checks to test for the status code 200, but also there's a status label, or so 200 OK, 404 not found, and we can check against those things as well. So if you could have a custom label within your own context, and you might want to check for that every time you press send. So you're able to do that with some of these functions we have available. So this top one is just looking for the OK. And then, as well as the OK, that's cool. If you get a 200 back, and it could be returning some XML, it could be returning anything. So if you want to add a check in there to check that it's JSON, if you have a JSON response in your API, you can do that. So this is just exposing you to some of the other things that you want to check for, and you can do it automatically every time you press send. But as well as this, checking the JSON body or the status label, we can also check the headers. So obviously there's going to be lots of headers returned, and some of these might be really important to you. It might be a custom header that you're adding into your endpoint, and we can expose some of this within the test itself. So again, every time you press send, you're checking for these things every single time, and you're not eyeballing it, going to the headers tab, looking to check that the header's there. You know, because you've added, yes sir. I saw that.
Also for something inside the body?
Yes?
Yes. String or whatever?
Yep. So we're going to move on to that in example 4. That's a great question. I like that. I didn't pay him at all. He's set me up there. So this is just like kind of looking at, yes?
So you have pre-built test on the right-hand side, on the right-hand side pane?
Yes. I can't see it.
So can we also save our tests so that we can reuse them later just by the click of a button? So
There is certain ways you can do that.
okay.
Like you're mentioning, you can't necessarily do that straight away in the app itself, but there are methods and different processes that you can follow to bring those tests, kind of a global test within a script itself, and bring those in and run them every single time. You can kind of customize it a little bit. It's not as easy as you want it to be, or I want it to be, but all those things are available to you, and that's a great thing that we can talk about after, because that's something a bit more complex, and we can run through that.
Sure.
Yourself or anybody else. That's cool. So that was a question around having customized scripts within the application itself. So we've gone through some of the snippets. Having the ability to add your own snippets in there would be super awesome. However, there are different ways that we can achieve that through different bits of code, but we can talk about that when we've got some more time. So the tests within this example that you can see on the screen, like I said, they're very high level. They're checking for things like the status code. You can check for things like, is the response JSON? Is it empty? Is it, it could be anything. But it's just introducing you to things that I don't want people to eyeball it and do this manually. We have a test function within Postman, and you can expose some of these functions or some of these ideas or some of these test little nuggets of things that you want to check for, and you can do it every single time. So you know that if you do hit send and someone further down the line has, or before you, has made a change that's impacted your endpoint or whatever, you're going to be alerted to that straight away because your test is going to be failing. This is not going to change. If there's a change that's happened, your test is going to tell you. So it's going to alert you to those things that's happened.
Danny has a good story about that as well if you want to know.
Great story. It's one of the best.
It's another slide we took out, just so you know.
Yeah, it's one that we keep removing slides.
Keep removing the good ones. Sorry, guys.
But
What's taking so long?
the internet. So, I mean, that's going to take time, but is anybody having trouble with running the request themselves and seeing the out? Yeah, I love it. Help us. So we want to see these in the test tab. Like we did with the first section, these tests will be shown in the test tab. And all the, I like it, timed out, everyone using run me.
Well, as we mentioned, it's not very performant. Oh.
So random me is...
Oh, random me. Okay, so we're just taking down random me.
Yeah, we just
API,
absolutely caned.
So it's not our own. We're good.
Yeah, that'd be great. So that's okay. It doesn't matter if the endpoint's running. Actually, this is quite cool because it's going to show you the failures. Yes, sir?
It looks like the result from this request is a big HTML file. Is there a preview button, something like this?
So this, I believe we've absolutely nailed their endpoint just by us making requests. So this is what we get back. This is the preview button. So the particular endpoint that we're using is just randomized data. So every time you make a request, it's going to return with a subset of data.
So as you can see, they need to do
This is a good
better
test.
API testing.
This is a great test of what's happening if you're maximizing the traffic against a particular API.
Maybe there's somebody from there in the audience because they could learn something here.
So there's lots of different things. As much as that's not actually worked as I expected, which is awesome, we can see the test failures. So we are checking for certain things. That test is run, and these things aren't happening. So again, this is alerting you to things that you know that you want to be true are actually failing. So these are like change detectors. They're responses that you want to see and telling you that something's not right. So this could be running on any sort of system. Unless you're adding tests to check for these things that you want to check for, you're not going to know, but these things are happening. Unless you eyeball it, which no one wants to do with multiple requests. So hopefully we move forward to example 4. I want to hope that the API endpoint actually returns anything. If it doesn't return anything, we're screwed. Absolutely caned it.
Wow.
Sweet.
Don't tell them it was us.
Yeah, don't tell them it was us. So, I mean, that's kind of in a way, that's secondary. So what I want to show you is different aspects of what the tests are. Rather than the fact that you're testing against something, that would be cool if you could see the response. But, but at the moment, because we want to set up tests to check for certain things, in the response itself, we can use the char assertions to check for different aspects of the response. So hopefully at some point, when everyone stops press send.
Something tells me they don't have good alerting for when their system goes down.
We panicked.
I think we may have taken it down for a while.
That's okay. So this is slightly different. So the gentleman in the front asked about asserting against different aspects of the response. So this is kind of like opening up the power of Postman to do those certain things. So you can use different JavaScript methods along with char.js. So these getters will start with .2, And you can check for if the response body is empty. It's kind of empty at the moment, but not what we want to. But also things like the response itself. It could have an array. It could have an object you want to check for. It could be a particular value within an array that you want to check for. So you can use different JavaScript functions and methods to loop through different aspects of data and use some of these different chai assertions to check for things like, are the keys present? Are they the right keys you want to look for? Is it an object with these keys? And if the response coming back is not that, again, it's going to alert you for the test failures. And at the moment, everything fails. So there's lots of different things happening here. I would like to walk through these, but I think with the response itself and not being able to see what the response is, it's not really going to be very beneficial to anybody. But you've got these now imported. You've also got the link to the GitHub repo with that collection. And you can import these and manipulate things in your own time. So you can see different things happening here. And if you want to check against a certain value for something in your own endpoints, hopefully some of these examples can show you how you can do that. And as well as looking for things like the object, you can also start expanding your test. So you want to, if it's a string value, you want to make sure it's not empty. You want to make sure it's not null. You want to make sure it's not undefined. So these things you can add into your test. So every time it runs, you can check for multiple different things at the same time. But there's also things where you can use regex to match against a certain string. So it might be a certain date format. So in the UK, we like our date formats in a particular way. In the US, they like their date formats in a particular way. So I can add things like regex or regular expressions to test for these certain things. And Postman, along with the chai assertions, will allow you to do that. Let's try it one more time. Is it going to work? No, it's not going to work. Yeah. Totally bummed.
Well, we said we were going to do it live, so here we go.
Live.
Right?
So hopefully, if we move past this, so we'll go back onto example 5. So this is the last one I'm going to work through, mainly because I want you to have these to take away and look through in your own time, to see these different things happening, to see the things like the console log, but also there's a kind of introduction to schema validation. So as well as some of the things you can check individually, you can check against the schema itself. So you can check for all these different aspects of the response, rather than have every individual test check for every individual thing. The schema itself can be validated against the response, and you can do it that way. So I'm not going to go into that one. That's just for you to go and have a look for yourself. And we're here afterwards, so we can go through that in a bit more in depth. But it's a bit more involved to talk about here. So hopefully this request will work, because this is using the Postman Echo service. So unless we take that down as well, which is a possibility, this will hopefully resolve when we press send. So this request itself, there's a lot of things going on as well. So I don't really want to go through the whole thing. But what we're going to do, like we did with the start, we looked at the pre-request script, but get executed before the actual request is sent. So some of the things in this post request, they've got variables that are going to be set in the pre-request. So we're going to look at that tab in a minute. And before the request is set, it's going to set all these variables and resolve to whatever I want before pressing set, before it's sent to the API itself. So within, can everyone see? So within this pre-request script, we're using some of the built-in libraries. So I mentioned before about using Moment.js, about using Lodash. And some of these utility functions are really useful when you want to create different aspects of test data, and you want to use some of the functions within there to do that. I want to take a stop there, because I talk really fast, as you can tell. But I want to make sure everyone's OK with what they're seeing. I know we're kind of moving through different examples, but I want to take some time to actually answer some questions if you have questions now, because I think there's probably loads, because there's lots of different things going on here that you might not have seen, you might not know about, and because we haven't seen some of the responses, you can't really relate them back into your mind. I know you got a question at the back.
Apart from these libraries that we have mentioned, can we add any custom libraries?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Can we add any custom libraries?
Custom libraries? Yeah, I mean, there's certain ways, like with the snippets you can add and the custom scripts that you can add into the application. There are ways to bring those custom libraries in as well. And again, these are things that are probably a bit more for later on when we've had a drink and we've decompressed a bit. But there are different ways to do this. And then I don't want to kind of gloss over to say, oh, there are different ways to do that, and not actually follow up that with an answer. But it's a kind of more involved answer for the time now. But we can work through that. That's cool.
And one more question on the prerequisites. Can we run a test from a different collection or from the same collection as a prerequisite for this test?
Can you run a different test from a different collection?
Yeah. So when we're running this test, can we run a different test as a prerequisite?
Within the application, no. Not because you're running a test against the particular collection that you're in or the particular request you're in. So that will be external from this collection itself. So you wouldn't be able to link that up to a different collection at this time.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I want to piggyback on the same question.
Wanna-
Can we use the functions from other collection to the current one?
So bringing in different functions?
Yeah, different functions
collections?
from other collections. Like if I write a assertion function,
Yep.
other test, and then I want to use that function instead of copy pasting here in the collection, the current collection. Is there possibility to point it to that collection and from the current one?
Well, you can set it as a global variable, so you can have it running against any collection you have. So as long as you reference that global variable, you could run it against any collection you have in your application.
Okay. Global variable.
Another one over there. Oh. 2, 3.
Hi, I have one more question. Very similar to what the topic is. It's very similar to util library. So, the team wants to have a set of reusable functions that can be used across the board. And right now, I am not finding a really good way of, reusing that. So how do we solve that?
Yeah, so that's that's actually something we get from the community a lot. There are ways you can address that. They're probably not the best approach, and this is actually something that we do have in our backlog that we want to address. But basically what you can do, and like I say, it's not ideal, and I don't want to get too deep into the details of it, but you can take like custom JavaScript functions, things like that, and jam it into a environment variable or a global variable, and then call that within like your pre-request or your test script tabs, and actually like kind of call those functions out and reuse them. Like I say, it's not ideal, and there's definitely better ways for us to do that, and it is in our backlog to address that. Okay, so we have another one in the back, and then you. Okay, so we'll go back here.
Is there any straightforward way of scheduling these tests?
So within like the Postman application itself, so we have there's monitors, which I think Kosov talked about a little bit today and was covered in other sessions. But yeah, so you can use Postman monitors for things like that. And also if you're using any sort of like CI/CD type system, you can do things like that. Or you could even just like run cron jobs and stuff. And we can kind of talk a little bit about how you do that via like CLI and things like that in, I think it's our next module. So you'll kind of get a better idea. And if you want to talk a little bit more about details around that, feel free to come talk to us after. I think we had one more question here.
So there are custom snippets here, right? So is it possible to create our own snippets?
Not at this time. That's another thing I believe is in our backlog. I'm getting yes.
I think that answered the previous questions.
Yeah, it was a similar question I had.
That's right.
You asked before.
Yeah.
That's okay. As long as the question's along the same lines, which is quite good in a way, because we're hearing more information about what could be possible, or should be possible, or may be possible.
Yeah, that's good.
So are there any more questions? I know, is anyone?
So
Sorry.
this is not so much about the tests themselves, but I guess I was wondering if you can describe if there's a pattern or a best practice around if I've got a collection, a documentation collection, and then I want to take that documentation collection and I want to build a test collection based on it. It seems like it's always somewhat by hand. If there are patterns that exist to sort of automate that.
I think that kind of falls under the new API environment that we have that's still in beta. We can do that basically, like kind of like you're almost talking about like reverse engineering it in a way, like have our documentation generate collections and stuff from that documentation and test from that. Is that what you're asking?
Or to have a subset of tests that you have built up and then you want to use.
Yeah, so that kind of falls along the lines of like API first design and things like that. So that's definitely like what you had said there is basically like the proper way and the way that we're trying to coach people to develop, design, and test their APIs these days is using an API first design so that you can, and there's a lot of benefits and we could probably talk endlessly about that, but in practice, if you're doing an API first design, you're gonna have a source of truth like your schema, Open API, RAML, whatever it may be. You're gonna have that and you're gonna base both the development and your testing off that. So the great thing with that is, and this is, I've experienced this in practice as well, is the developers will go off and they're starting to create this API. And ourselves as quality engineers, we can go off as well and start creating tests against a mock server because we know that they're designing against the same spec that we're designing our tests against. And then basically, once the developers have something stood up and it's ready for testing, you swap out something like maybe a URL and maybe some auth and you're ready to go. Right? So your tests are already written and you get away from that waterfall methodology and things like that. And it definitely cuts down on the cycle of development time. So I think that's kind of what you're asking there. Yeah.
And it's just that, are there patterns to automate or best practice around building those test cases? So for example, in my documentation, if I've got 4 mock responses, I'd love to press a button and generate a new collection that has 4 requests. Right, one for each of those mock responses, and I've still got to go in and I've got to populate the bodies to make it happen.
Yeah.
But I know I'm able I know my test coverage is going to be good because it's exactly what was in the design.
Yeah, no, and that's yeah. So like doing it exactly in the scenario that you're describing, I don't think we kind of really cover that. No, that's not how we don't really cover it specifically that way. But we do it in a very similar fashion. But we use the specification as the guide for generating all of these tests and these collections and things like that. So that's kind of an interesting use case. And that's what we love about having these types of workshops and having people out there ask these sorts of questions because it gives us a different view of things that we had not understood how people are using our tool. So that kind of stuff is gold. So thanks for asking that question.
So as a follow-up to that, if you create the collection that you write all these tests against, and you're using a mock server when you write the test, is it just a matter of changing your environment and starting to hit that production or the testing URL once it's done?
And that's the power of environment files. You can just swap out the same variable name that you've had, whatever environment, and then just swap the environment out, and it's going to be pointing at something else. So it's cool.
And the power in that, in like bigger companies that are standing up multiple APIs and you're churning these things out daily, is you can use this as part of your CI/CD system, which we will talk about a little bit later on. But as you promote things from environment to environment, all you're doing is just swapping out, like say URLs, maybe some auth headers, things like that, and it just you can point to any environment. So it gives you the most flexibility possible with a collection doing things like that. And really, the possibilities are endless in how you do that, but that's the proper way if you're going to use some sort of a CI/CD pipeline for your builds, or just to make it super extensible.
Can I ask one more?
No, you're cut off.
On the topic of environments, I tend to generate a lot of sort of temporary environment variables, from the result of a previous call to pass it into the next call after a post. I want to do a get to validate it, and I find those then clutter up my real environment. Is there a scratch environment that I can write to?
So you can unset variables, and that kind of comes down to like good practices and like housekeeping, because I've done that, right? And then I end up with this environment file that has just so much junk in it, and like 95% of it is useless stuff that, like you say, it's generated as building my tasks and things like that, and I'm just creating all this stuff, and then after I've created it, I no longer use it. Good housekeeping would be that you would tear that down, or you can also generate environment files kind of on the fly using other systems outside of Postman. That's like super in-depth stuff that I do not even want to touch on in this at all. But there are ways to do that, which keeps things super clean. But it kind of comes down to a housekeeping sort of thing. If you're doing stuff locally, development stuff, you're gonna make a mess, and you should probably have some like best practices around housekeeping for cleaning up those variables as you create them and things like that.
But you can't have like two environments active at the same time. Your scratch one and your one that you want to share with everyone, your CI.
Not in the sense that you're asking, but you can use Workspaces and things like that, which can keep things totally separate. So you have a scratch workspace where you're doing all the stuff, making this big mess. And then once you've got it kind of honed in, you can switch to another workspace that'll have different environments and keeps it a little more clean. So yeah, there are ways to do it. Yeah.
I think with clearing out in environment variables or global variables, the approach I've taken in the past is that I've wrote a little function and housed that in the test script. So that will go through and dynamically clear out those things. But also, because it's JavaScript, you can put an if statement in if it doesn't match a certain prefix that I might have put to my variable names. So I might want to keep 3 of them, but I want to get rid of the rest of them, and vice versa. So there are things and different methods and strategies you can use to do that within the test script. And I can share a little function with you after that I've used to do that. Yeah, so that was kind of like, I didn't intend to ask questions. It was more to do with, it was a bit of a fail with some of the requests there. And as much as you've got the ability to see what's going on in the test script, or being able to maybe ask some questions after about what you can see, some of the things might not be familiar with you, especially using some of the built-in libraries with Lodash and the different functions within Lodash. But all these different things that I've mentioned, the links to these different documentations are on the GitHub repo. So if you link out to that and you want to just mess around with creating random numbers or using some of the functions in there. So I've just added a few examples in here where I'm kind of shuffling an array, or I'm taking out the duplicates or the unique values. I want to have just unique values in an array. And these little kind of utility methods, especially with Lodash, are really powerful enough for you to do this. So, I mean, you could probably hit send on this if you haven't done already. You probably have. Most people have already, because I haven't listened to the questions. And you can see the kind of result of this. So as I press send there, because some of the things that I've created, especially like an end date and a start date with a kind of gap in the middle, using like an add 30 days method within a certain format.
You can kind of show what's going on. Yeah.
That could be easier. Yes, I mean, Trent's just opened up the kind of code snippets, which are available as well. And this just to show what's actually happening in the URL when it got sent and the variables that are resolved. So this is just me. I've created a date timestamp of a particular format using moment, because I can do that. And also with the end date, I've just kind of added 30 days, so I have the kind of difference between timestamps. It's an example of what you can do. And you can do multiple different things. It's just using some of these built-in things that you might not know already are in there, and you can use lots of different methods in there.
Just figured it was easier.
Pardon?
Figured it was easier for you.
Thank you.
Rather than talking about it, we could show you.
Thank you very much.
So we switch back to slides.
So yeah, that was partly epic fail, but hopefully some of the new things that you've been introduced to, like dynamic variables, it seemed like there was a lot of hands that people didn't know that was in there. And now you have the ability to use them, you know what you can use them for. The documentation will show you what things are actually in there. And also with the autocomplete things, you can see what kind of things you can use within different aspects of the application itself where you can use dynamic variables. We've also covered some of the kind of built-in modules, some of the Chai assertions, which I apologize we couldn't actually use because we actually maxed out the API I was going to use. But you've got those available to you now. So you've got the collection locally, and you can work for them yourselves, or you can apply them some to your own context. Maybe take some of those things out, and take especially the Chai assertions, and try and formulate some tests in your own context to check for these different aspects of a response. Maybe you're doing it already. Maybe this is just a chance to branch out and check for different aspects of that.